Okay, here we go. Today I will talk about, basically financial malware. It's typically called banking malware, but I would say that term is too specific because that type of malware does not just target banking. And financial malware is also not actually a term which completely catches it, but if you think about it, that it is used for monetary gain in some ways, could be credit card fraud or also stealing information. Those are the things that financial malware is used for. I will talk about the landscape of malware, so to talk about what kind of things are done, what kind of malware families exist, what types of attacks they carry. And the situation in Korea, I will give 3 different examples of banking malware attacks that take place, that have taken place here. And I'll also go into their level of success. And I will discuss a bit of point-of-sale attacks, which I know also happen here. I don't have any actual examples for Korea, but just like the same type of attacks would work here that would work in the US, where it's very popular to use this type of malware. I have to very quick about me. I've worked for a company called Fox IT in the Netherlands for 10 years now, almost. I'm a principal security expert there, and I've kind of made my hobby, the things that I like to do, my work. So that means that I tend to work a lot of hours a day just because I also like doing it, but it makes me also very tired sometimes. And as you all know, my birthday today, so. Just a quick introduction to financial malware or banking malware. One of the main purposes is to, intercept information and manipulate information. So one of the most basic properties that most malware of this type has is that it can recover stored passwords. It typically is able to unlock encrypted databases with stored passwords of browsers, of many applications that are on a system. But it also can steal stored certificates, especially those in software-based certificate stores. But also it can intercept live data, so basically like sniff the network. Some malware is able to sniff FTP protocols and other plain text protocols, and others, most actually, will be able to sniff the browser, and it's not really sniffing an interface, it's just hooking or intercepting certain functions in the browser. And it's done for almost every browser that exists. All major ones. So Internet Explorer, Chrome, and Firefox, that's basically the standard. Most current malware will support that. So this manipulation, that's something else. That's not just obtaining information, that is also changing the information that, that a victim of this malware will see. So think about you're receiving a web page from your bank, or from any website whatsoever. It's encrypted, it has SSL, so it has end-to-end encryption, but by manipulating the browser in a way, in a certain way, they're able to manipulate that. And that's the whole key concept of most banking malware. By being able to do that, they can do a lot of other things as well. So you can manipulate the behavior of the browser as well. You can inject a JavaScript, which is actually not part of the malware itself, it's just is able to manipulate the data that is coming back from the bank, inject a JavaScript, and the JavaScript is then executed by the browser, and they can do everything. The JavaScript, they can make its own requests, it can even make post data requests. So, for example, what you can do, if you manipulate the stream, the SSL stream of an online banking system, you can inject a script which will automatically add a transaction. It's a very simple way to do it, and this type of attack would work here as well. Because you're basically, as a victim, you're browsing to the internet, you're authenticating on your bank, and the only thing you need to do is enter an OTP. the OTP, the small devices that most banks issue these days. A lot of people still have the old indexed TAN cards, the cards with all the numbers on it. You might know what I mean. But basically, adding a transaction is a very simple process. You just need to understand how the bank works inside. So just what kind of requests are sent to the bank and from the bank. Now, some of the Korean banks actually use the applications that are installed to, I guess, provide their own kind of encryption or own SSL instead of using HTTPS. So in that case, standard Trojan will not work, and you would have to write something custom for that solution because it's not using the standard browser interface, which the Trojan hooks. So the last point is simple. So what kind of ways can you use to manipulate the data? And it really depends. So during the past 10, 15 years, there have been multiple ways to manipulate web pages, and the most simple one is like the interface that that Internet Explorer, for example, offers. That's using a browser helper object. A browser helper object basically is a plugin, and it has access to the full document object model, so it can modify anything in the web page. The other way is simply to, probably I didn't see many of the presentations, but I guess that probably it's discussed, or code injection. It's just you have a running process, you attach to it, and you inject code or a full DLL, or you make it load a DLL, and you then place hooks on key functions that you want to intercept within the program flow. And actually, the last method is the most commonly used method. But for example, in case a new browser appears, such as Chrome a few years ago, sorry about that. That was my computer telling me to speed up, sorry. So for example, when Chrome appeared, it was new, and that actually, initially the first banking Trojans actually used a plugin rather than code injection, because they still had to research Chrome and understand how it really worked. Okay, so this is, and it's a bit vague. Oh, anyway, this picture is a representation of, well, a large part of the malware landscape. And it's not up to date, and some things are missing, because this is constantly changing. There are constantly new variants coming up. Important to catch from this is we classify it into 3 groups. The right part is all the kit malware, what we call kit malware, and basically it's a product that you buy, and you can set it up by yourself, and you can use it by yourself. Basically, you go to an underground forum, and they offer it, or you can actually, in some underground forums, they offer pirated versions of it. So software piracy also, is just in the underground as well. Then the other 2 on the left, there is some overlap between the 2, but it means rented malware and private malware. Rented malware is one where you have all the functionality that you would have on the, like if you would buy it as a finished product, but they do everything for you. They set it up, they have the command and control server ready for you, they will even register domains for you if your domains get taken down, move it around if the server is taken down, things like that. And the other group is private malware. That's basically, you're as a group, as a team, you're working together, and you're all working together on the same attacks. That's basically private malware. There's sometimes some cross between the 2, sometimes, because private malware is more safe because it's trusted group, and with rented malware you're getting customers who might not be holding the same kind of security measures on their own systems, for example, or they might not be trusted very well. So in general, banking malware has had over 10 years of mainstream attacks. Started with Limbo and Zeus. That's basically when two-factor authentication attacks against two-factor authentication started. Since then, always variants of the same types of things. There's new Trojans appearing, but they're all the same. They are all inspired by the previous versions. And I'll come back later on that, but one of the things, Zeus started with a configuration format called web injects. And actually, I think that 99% of all the Trojans that are currently out there all support this same configuration format. So within the underground economy, basically this became an industry standard. And this industry standard is basically to have a configuration which explains what to modify in the online banking stream, for example, or in the web page that is returned by the bank, what to modify at which places. So it's a very simple configuration format, just has a number of rules that it goes through. And these guys are typically very practical, so they just make something, it works, they ship it, they don't think too much about security and other things, and you know, if it breaks, they fix it and ship it again. When it comes to actually researching this, it is not too much challenging overall. There are some exceptions where it's really difficult to reverse engineer, or they're really protecting themselves well. In some cases, for example, they're very targeted at one specific country, and if you are not researching it in that country, you will not find out how it exactly works, because it has another stage or another part that you cannot get easily, for example. So there are also a few interesting examples of malware. Peer-to-peer Zeus is one of them. It started as the original Zeus. Then about, I think, 2009, they started the group together that started to do online banking attacks in a more organized way, and especially targeting corporate banking platforms, which is, you know, corporate bank accounts usually have a lot more money and are able to move a lot more money. And they modified the malware. They actually, the original author of Zeus kind of retired, and he actually went private. So before he was making the kit malware, which was the part on the right of the graph, now he was doing this private malware and developing only for this smaller team. And by, say, small team, it's still more than 50 people that were involved. And it was challenging because instead of traditional communications, it used a peer-to-peer network, and it was quite well made. It had some vulnerabilities in the peer-to-peer network, but whenever someone started to abuse those vulnerabilities in the peer-to-peer network to take it down, they quickly recovered from that and fixed the vulnerabilities that were abused. So they were very quick to fix it. They used very good bulletproof hosting. Often people say, well, this hosting is bulletproof, and it's not really. But what they used was servers that were rented and stationed somewhere in Ukraine, we believe, did not actually have an IP address, but they transported whole net blocks with BGP and various VPN tunnels over to there. So all the IP addresses were really virtual. The IP address was assigned to a server which was in a completely different country, but finally the IP was transported over many networks and then finally arrived in Ukraine, where it was assigned to a server. If someone blocked the IP address, they could simply get a new one. If someone blocked the whole net block, they would just get a new net block. And that has worked for, well, the past 10 years, basically. And they're still doing that today. And it's very difficult for law enforcement to, well, get after this, because it goes through so many countries, and it's constantly changing, that it's hard for them to really figure out where it is going. And additionally, the people who were doing this group, peer-to-peer Zeus group, were very experienced. They had many years of experience, and this showed in the behavior they had. And if, for example, something didn't work, they just moved on to another target, the next target. They didn't continue to work on the same problem and try to see if they could solve it. If someone was being difficult, they would just move to another target that was easier. This is a simplified view. It's already complex, but a simplified view of the peer-to-peer Zeus network. So on the left, you have a peer-to-peer layer. You have some concept of supernodes. They're talking to a proxy layer, and they're talking to the bulletproof backends. And then within the backends are traditional Zeus instances. So there were 28 different instances, And also through the same proxy layer, you could reach the fraud backend. So you had the malware control backends, and you had the fraud backend where when an online banking attack happened, the attackers could communicate through that fraud backend. And there would be a man in the middle between the victim and the online banking session that they opened. Interesting to see. It's not so sharp, I think, but here below you see a builder and a debug bot. Basically, they had all kind of their own systems that were connecting to the same peer-to-peer network to monitor it. So one was to monitor it to see attacks against the peer-to-peer network. Another was to use the builder, and the builder is used to build the malware, the updates, and the configurations, but also they would get a seed list of peer-to-peer nodes, put it in the builder, and the builder would then connect to the peer-to-peer network and spread RSA-signed messages, which could contain a configuration or an update or other messages such as the selection of supernodes or information on proxies. So when it comes to actual group, this is just one example. The peer-to-peer Zeus had two leaders. One of them was Slavic, which we'll get into a little bit later. They had a support team, which was supporting various extra services that were offered. And they had a lot of third-party suppliers. So in this underground economy with banking malware, there are a lot of extra services that are offered. Things from exploit kits to infect people, spamming services to deliver the malware via email to people, other, supporting malware, which could be a loader or could be, for example, the ransomware that actually encrypts files on your system, things like that. And you will see that the lowest part, that's all the other different teams. And there were 28 different teams that were using it, some only for a short time, some for the entire time. And one team could consist up to, well, in one case what we saw was that there were 5 people working together in one specific instance. So that's interesting at least. And they would pay a certain fee, and after they paid the fee, they would basically share the profits. So they had a good trust relationship between basically the customers and the people that ran the group. Basically, this guy was indicted last year. He was indicted at the end of May, and at the same time, the infrastructure was taken down, so all these servers that we saw, and the peer-to-peer network was taken over. So by poisoning nodes and doing some tricks, they were able to reroute all the peer-to-peer traffic to a select number of nodes and be able to control them. The indictment, the guy was in Russia, and Russia does not extradite people, and also, even though multiple requests have been made, they have never really prosecuted him because he did not do any fraud in Russia itself. And in Russia, even if you do crimes against institutions in Russia, they will be very upset about it and will prosecute that person. But if you are only attacking banks in other countries, they don't care too much. So what types of attacks are there? So I've been referencing a lot to what is called transactional fraud. So that's actually going to online banking and making an actual transaction. There are other types of fraud as well. I touched upon it. That's like credit card information social engineering. So you're social engineering the data that you need to create a transaction using credit card details. And you also have other information that you can gather and monetize at a later point. But one of the main things that is being done is transactional fraud. And there you have automated attacks, which is something I touched upon before. If you manipulate the browser behavior, you can inject a JavaScript, and the JavaScript can create a transaction. The JavaScript can actually ask the user to enter an OTP or whatever is needed or whatever is required to confirm the transaction, and then submit the transaction. So that can be completely automated, and that happens a lot. Although it is a little bit more difficult to implement. You have to make a script, and you have to know how the website works. The other method is what we call hybrid. it's a mix between phishing and malware. So normally phishing site, you're getting an email and it says you have to go to this website or an SMS or anything, any way that they can lure people. In the case of a hybrid attack, basically the malware intercepts a session when the victim goes to online banking, but redirects it to a phishing site. And it can be done in many different ways. I mentioned already the web-inject industry standard. And when it comes to attacks, a lot of the attacks target consumer banking. So consumers, they have usually less money in their account, but they're easier to target. It's easier to get infections on normal people that have a PC and do online banking. Corporate infections is difficult. Mostly the networks are secured better, but in many cases it's still possible to get there. And what we typically see is that corporate account takeovers, is what we call it, are done in the hybrid way. So basically luring, or well, not luring, when the victim goes to the corporate online banking site, it's redirected to a phishing site. It will look identical to the online banking site. It's just asking for a little bit more information, and will finally ask for transaction confirmation codes. And even in case with corporate bank accounts, what you have is that you have in every country it's called different, but we call it the 4I principle. So one person creates the transaction, and then a second person has to sign the transaction. It's a checker or a transaction maker and a checker or approver. In that case, they would actually ask the second person to come to the infected person's computer and enter all these details there. So that's an interesting concept. Some banks did not think about this issue. Others they did, and they said, we will tie the account of the checker to another PC. It cannot be the same PC as the guy that does the transactions. To get into some examples, this was something which was, I think, in December last year. Well, whenever the movie came out, which was called The Interview, which you might remember probably. This was an application for Android, which it was supposedly to download the movie for free, and it came out when when the whole the Sony hack appeared and all that things you might remember. So actually it targeted a large number of online banking applications, mobile banking applications in Korea. And the only thing that it did was basically to steal certificates and social engineer some extra information. It was targeted for Android. The extra information was simply like your national ID here, your certificate and transaction passwords. So with that information, they could probably set up online banking or mobile banking on their own system with your account. They could also social engineer, because actually they had your phone, so they could look up your phone number. But what they did actually was block all the phone calls. So even the bank could not call the victim, but also the attackers could not actually call the victim. So that seems like a missed chance, but okay. Interesting was that they had two devices which were supposedly blocked from loading the second stage of the malware, which was Samjeong and Arirang, which are North Korean Android devices. However, the check that was implemented for Arirang the logic for it was wrong, so we do load anyway. And I'm not actually sure that, it obviously, it's meant to say that, this malware was created by North Koreans, and it would not infect those systems, but it does not really make sense to me. But who knows? It's maybe a false flag, or maybe it was made by North Koreans. I have no idea. Another feature that it has was interception of SMS. Those were sent to the HTTP-based CNC, but also could be sent to an email address. The malware itself was already in circulation for a while, but as I don't really investigate a lot of the attacks in Korea, I'm not sure how actually active it is. Another attack that we saw about a year ago, I think, another very simple attack. It's basically like this hybrid attack. It's phishing, but you're modifying the hosts file. It's the most old and simple attack that exists. On the Windows, you have the hosts file, which resolves a certain name or a website name to an IP address. So basically, they set all the banking websites to a certain IP address, and from that, you can see it's a simple phishing attack. When you look at the actual domain names, they actually had, instead of bank, they had dank as well. And I was thinking about, like, why is that? Maybe they did that because they thought people would write or would mix up the B and the D. When I just started to learn Korean texts, I sometimes mixed up the and the A and wrote things in a wrong way. But I don't think that a lot of people would actually mix B and D, but who knows? Maybe that was their thinking. But they also had a lot of spelling mistakes, like Shinhan instead of Shinhan, and SC first is like 2 I's instead of the, I think I can, like here there's 2 I's instead of 1 I. I'm not sure why they made so many spelling mistakes. It's like they didn't even check it very properly. Well, anyway. How does this attack work? Well, the first, you get the normal web page. It was an older web page from like a few months earlier. It would all look like the normal web page of that bank. The second, you get an error message. I think you can't really read it very well. It's probably not clear enough, but it was a message saying something like, "Oh, you need to enroll your certificate again." That's something people do here. You need a certificate for your online banking, so you need to enroll again. Okay, happens. I'll have to do it again. Second, there was an error in the loading page. It said something, but that was just an error on the attacker's part. You had the loader which said like, well, you have to do some things and you have to install some things. Anyway. The next was that you had to fill in some information a little bit, your password, your national ID, and things like that. And the next page, you had to fill in all the rest of the information. So as you know, basically this part was the where you had to fill in all the numbers that were in a card. I think when your bank starts to ask you for this, most people will think this is not right. But obviously, I've seen these attacks in the past in the Netherlands. People actually do fill it in. And these are only 35 fields. In the Netherlands, we used to have these cards with 100 fields. And seriously, people just fill in all the 100 fields. It's really a lot of work, but they did it. And the last, you get an error, which, again, maybe not very readable, but it was an interesting... There were some interesting mistakes in the language constructs. Gogenim, I think, was written in the wrong way. That said, well, my Korean friend said that it seemed not that it was written by someone who was actually Korean. Maybe someone who knew quite a bit of Korean. We don't know really, but. When we had access to some of the websites that they used to control this malware, where basically the reports came in, the entire backend was written in Korean, which is strange. I mean, for example, if it would be anyone from another country, you wouldn't use Korean language. Now, obviously, I don't know where the guy really is from. He was logging in from China. Obviously, there is some has been some historic immigration towards China. So maybe it's one of the Korean communities in China that one of the people has been doing this. I'm not sure. Anyway, inside you could see all the banks that were targeted, but also you could see the reports. And the only reports that we saw were the ones where they entered all fake data, just to test it themselves, or that it were victims who knew that, well, this is not good, or were researchers that were testing. Everything is possible. A third attack that we saw, and that was actually from this year, it happened suddenly by the end of February. Interestingly, 2 banks were targeted. What they do in this attack is, again, a hybrid attack. So when the browser is trying to go to one of the sites, it will actually redirect it to an internal, well, basically randomized domain, and that will look that up, and will send it to the IP address listed above. Basically, a very simple, straightforward attack to social engineer information with that information that they can set up a new session where they can make a transaction. Dire is very global. It is targeting many different regions and very successfully. It's also targeting corporate banking mostly, so large transactions of hundreds of thousands of dollars up to several million of dollars. And it goes to, for example, accounts in Hong Kong, accounts in the eastern of Europe or the Middle East. They try to find ways to get people to open large corporate accounts, move money into that, and then spread it over multiple accounts. And then after that, they do things with that money. It's not entirely clear how what kind of methods they use, but they seem to be actually buying equipment and stuff and moving that back to Russia. That seems to be their MO, and then selling that stuff. Actually, an interesting thing, I'm not sure if Dimitri is still here. He's probably the only person that can read Russian, but I've made a Google translation myself as well. Basically, they have job advertisements. So for tasks that they don't need specialists for, that need to know the malware, they actually just hire people on a regular website for recruitment called hh.ru. And there they are basically just asking for a Korean translator. And you might remember that the Korean targets were added at the end of February. This job advertisement was from the 4th of February. And basically what they're asking for is a Korean translator that can work between a certain time. And also that is either located in Moscow, or if working remotely, he or she has to be in Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine. Either of those 3. No other countries are accepted. Well, what did we actually see happen? We saw that there were, by the end of February, spam campaigns. Initially, these spam campaigns were for Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, and suddenly they also were for Korea. And these spam campaigns, how do they work? How do they get the email addresses, for example? They basically drop the malware on the already infected systems in a certain country. So typically, if your computer is in a certain country, you will have email contacts on your system, which will be, people that live in that country. It's not, it's not very scientific, but it is a simple way. It's the simplest way for them to spread the malware. So they are dropping basically a spam bot, which harvests contacts from Outlook, from Thunderbird, and other email clients, and sends the malware to those people with a nice template, like a fake invoice or anything like that. So it could be a Word document, it could be a zip with an exe in it, it could be all kind of simple ways to social engineer the malware on the system. These campaigns continued. At some point they also started to target Malaysia. But in the end, even though they had quite a bit of infections, they had, for example, in a small period, they had 1,600 new infections. The second most infected country in that period, only the US, which is a main target for Dire, really. And there are also 6,000 different banks in the US, so it's kind of a nice market for them. But that's, really signifies that it was really an intentional target that they had. But did it really work, was the question. So we don't really know if they had any success. And obviously, as I'm actually living here and I had to use the online banking here, it is kind of difficult for them to use it because they actually set up a new session to the online banking system from their own desktop, and then they have to install all these applications. They can't reuse it every time because the applications and the certificate is tied to a certain system. So they have to install all these programs and all that while the victim is still waiting. So he's waiting and waiting until you have to install all these applications. So it's a very difficult attack to create. It would be easier for them to just take over the desktop of the victim or create a hidden second desktop and do the transaction from there. But they're not capable of that with the current malware. They want it, so anyway, my conclusion is that it might have been just too complicated to execute this attack with their malware. So I guess that's a reason. I don't know why they did all the investment by recruiting a Korean translator, getting all the spam campaigns out. I'm not sure, maybe they had some small successes, but for sure they didn't do much more because just the 10 first days of July, they had a total of 3,870 infections, which is really not that much. So they're not doing the Korean spam runs anymore, so I'm pretty sure that they're not targeting anymore Korea. And well, they've moved on to other countries as well, in Europe, in Asia, and in the US. Okay. So another topic of financial malware, point of sale malware, and that's something that has been going on for quite a long time. You have, of course, the traditional skimming, which is more like in the physical domain, but you also have point of sale systems which run Windows very typically, or even the terminal does not run Windows. Then the terminal sends the information to some central server where the unencrypted information is also in memory, and that server will run Windows and is also going to be vulnerable at some point. So counterfeit cards, which is the cloned cards, the physical credit cards basically, or physical debit cards, they can be cloned, and that was already a popular crime when the Target breach happened, which was some 30 to 40 million cards which were exposed in that period. That really made everybody who was not into point of sale malware already consider it, definitely. And we've seen a lot more people get into that specific game. Now, to get to point of sale systems, a lot of the traditional criminals used to scan the internet for with default credentials and then try to get access to point of sale systems. That is a tactic which works. It still works today. Vendors just always use the same password for every point of sale system because otherwise the support would be a nightmare. But there's also another way which really works, and it's this in the same principle. They're using a remote management software like TeamViewer or LogMeIn or things like that. And they're actually, the criminals are now searching in botnets that collect all the information and searching for credentials for TeamViewer, LogMeIn, etc. and using those credentials to find support companies that support point of sale systems. So it's another way to create point of sale botnets, and actually once you have such an account you can have hundreds, and in some cases a recent breach was 8,000 point of sale systems. And 8,000 is really a lot because per day 100,000 cards were basically stolen. That is really a lot because the fraud risk, what banks calculate, is every card is $500 in risk. The actual fraud of a card can be thousands of dollars. So you can think about the monetary loss per day of this. Well, for us, unfortunately, but for the criminals, unfortunately, there are just not enough buyers to buy that amount of cards because you actually have to create a card for that and actually go to a store and buy something. But 100,000 cards is really a lot. Luckily, it has come down a bit, and it's more or less like 10 to 20,000 cards per day, which is still a lot, but a little bit less. One thing I wanted to go into, and I'm not sure how I'm doing with time. I think probably good. 10 minutes? Okay. Anonak was a group, you might have read about this. It was published late last year, our research. Kaspersky also did their research and posted a report that was called Carbonac. And basically this group was targeting two different markets. In Russia, they were actually targeting banks specifically. And their biggest target for that was the payment gateways. So a little bit similar as the talk of Dimitri just before, the payment gateways in Russia are a system which is really from the 80s or something. It's really old, and when they created it, they did not implement anything like authentication or authorization. So once you have access to a payment gateway in a Russian bank, you can move all the money of that bank. There is no limit, there is no accounts, there is no segregation, everything can be done. And that's what these guys learned. So really, that was their main target. If they had access to other systems within a bank, they would use, for example, send or put malware on ATM systems, which then they could basically modify to, well, in one case, one specific case, they would modify the denominations of the bills. So you would get 100 bills of, I don't know what the currency in the ruble, but what the bills are exactly in Russia. But, think about like a $5 bill, or, well, the system, the machine thinks that a $20 bill is actually a different value. So you get the system, the ATM machine thinks that it's giving you 100 $5 bills, but in reality it's giving you 100 $20 bills. That gives you much more money in a way that's very easy to make. And they actually used the testing software that the ATM company provided and did a simple patch to it, and that was all they needed to do. It's basically the management tool to modify ATM settings, and they did some patches to override the system internals. How did they get these infections? Mostly they just spammed people with like nicely themed lures. Just could be anything really, but simple ways. But another way they used was to buy infections from other people. So a lot of people have big botnets, but then they're not really using that information. They have a big botnet, they're using it for one type of fraud, which they get by, but then the other information that they steal, they don't use it. So other groups are interested in buying infections, and those infections can be worth a lot of money. Usually it's not that they're paying a certain amount, they just have a trust relationship. If they make a certain amount of money, they will have a profit share. So they get like 20% of the profit if that infection led to a big heist. Now, I said there were two regions for Anak, or two markets that they targeted. There was Europe and there was the US. In those markets, they actually did point-of-sale malware, which was very different from the attacks against banks. So they were actually breaching bigger organizations which had a physical retail stores, and were infecting those with malware. And they collected a little bit of cards, not really big volumes, but enough to make an impact at least. But it shows that there's two markets that these guys targeted. It's interesting because typically most criminals are focused on one type of business in one market, and then they can move to different markets. But in this case, they really did two completely separate things with the same malware. Because the malware was actually written to be able to monitor the desktop of the victims. So they would infect the system administrator of a company and then watched his desktop and saw what he did. And a system administrator, he's managing all these systems, so they exactly knew which system was doing what, had which role in the network, and how to connect to it. So that was very useful information for them to be able to breach into the network quickly when the administrator went home. This group is interesting because they're actually based in Ukraine, and as you know, this all started when the Ukraine and Russia conflict started. So even though they're in the next country, physically located there, Russia can't really do much because they're not at war, but their relationship is not really the best. So everybody in this world has a problem with this international crime, because in the internet you can access a server somewhere or an organization somewhere completely different country, and it works just as well. So these types of attacks, they cost a lot of money to the economy. In a big scale of things, it's not that much, but still, some banks actually went bankrupt because of this group. And then, well, it's a big issue, but then, we even know where the criminals are, but then we can't arrest them because the frauds were committed in another country and they don't work very well together. It's a difficult problem. So, to summarize, threats that happen are very global. The threats they're not just in one specific region. Traditionally, a lot of activity was in the US, and Europe was also targeted a lot, but now we see that these things are happening everywhere, and it's not just that a specific group, for example, that Chinese hackers are always targeting Korea and Japan, for example, but it's also Russian hackers who are doing the same thing. And when I say hackers, well, it's a bit of a weighted term, but so why is Korea actually targeted less than other countries? For example, in Japan, there have been a lot of attacks in the past years, but why is Korea not targeted? And I think it comes from, the ActiveX components and all those things which happen. It's difficult for them to actually hijack the desktop and do the attacks manually. It's time intensive, so they try not to do that. So I think that the difficult way to do online banking and set up online banking from a PC is actually helping deter certain types of fraud. It can be done, but it's more difficult. So that's why they probably don't even try that much. But language is definitely not a barrier. We see attacks against a number of countries, Arab countries, all over Asia really, where there's different language types. They simply hire a translator. That's a very simple solution to a difficult problem. And if you don't have a translator, Google Translate can translate a lot of language, and you don't really need to know exactly what is written there, but as long as you kind of understand what's written there, it might be just enough. And there is also an increase of targeting of other things. So not just online banking, but credit cards, that's traditionally already, point of sale systems, and other types of other types of information that the criminals can monetize. This can be personal information as well. I think that was the main part of my presentation. Actually, of these attacks, I was trying to contact some of the banks here as well. They were not very responsive, but in the end, maybe there was not actually any fraud. And I think it's better to be more proactive about these things, try to research them, and try to be ahead of the game, really, to understand how the attack works and try to assess the risk that you have. And I think it's also good for people to work together. So I think banks should work together on a lot of these fraud issues because it affects them all. And I'm not sure how well Korean banks are working together currently, but it's always good to have both a local but also an international outreach. It's good to know what happens in other countries around you, what types of fraud happen, and then apply that knowledge to better defend your own systems. And definitely, here there is a lot of security on the endpoint, basically the victim system, but it is not really the best way to secure a system because the victim is already compromised. The system is compromised, and the criminals will find ways to work around it, even though it might not be, it will always be a cat and mouse game on the computer. All right. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I want to thank you very much.